We have a lot to talk about, so let's dive in.
There is a deeply authoritarian impulse in a Republican Party that is led by Donald Trump.
Yes.
And that's a big part of the story, and that's been the last 8 years. And this is not a question of bias, to address the elephant in the room here.
So to speak, elephant.
Yeah, so to speak, elephant in the room. This is not a matter of interpretation. When you have the encouragement and you condone what happened on January 6th, and you support it and you promote it, that is authoritarian behavior, right? It was violent. Let's call it what it is. When Donald Trump says, I have an enemies list, and enemies list, we're probably going to get into this later, Scott, but that is classic authoritarian plus. The only area I would shade this a little bit, so it is not to disagree with Lucan in any way, voters who vote Republican, that is a different question. Because a lot of the survey interviews of voters, and because that's one of the questions Lucan and I asked all the time, how can 47% of Americans support this party? Voters have multiple motives and multiple reasons for what they do. And the sad part, and let me get to the headline first, many voters do not care about democracy. They care about other issues, but democracy is way down on the list of the things that they care about. And so that label, authoritarian or Democrat, is not a driving force for their vote.
From a social science perspective, the United States presents a genuine puzzle. You know who are the optimists in America? The people who studied large N democracy. Basically, there is a stunning correlation between wealth, if you exclude oil countries, and democracy. Basically, right now, 95%, basically all in social science terms, countries that are high income according to World Bank classifications are democratic. The two exceptions are Hungary and Singapore. That is nothing. So you look at that, and among poor countries, 30% are democratic. So that, by itself, you look at that number, and basically, and you look historically, no country as rich as the United States has backslid. So if you simply take, the last 200 years, you basically said, there's 1 in a million or 0% chance of the United States backsliding. Now, I also read the papers, and I think that's an incredibly naive point of view. But I think part of the reason it's naive is you have to understand why 95% of rich countries are democratic, and it's primarily because non-oil wealth spreads the resources across society. Middle class have money to contribute to campaigns, you have civil society, you have media, which makes it very hard for any single party to monopolize political control. But none of that guards against the intense polarization that's going on right now in the United States, right? And if you look at sort of the established democracies historically that have fallen, Chile in 1972, Venezuela, Hungary, by the way, much less established than the United States. Nonetheless, it's all due in large part to polarization.
Lucan, you talk about the kind of system that could come to the U.S. as competitive authoritarianism. Right. What do you mean by that?
Authoritarian systems are systems in which elections are the primary determinant of who gains and keeps power. So elections are central and competitive, genuinely competitive, but in which the incumbent engages in all sorts of abuse. So India right now is classic example of a competitive authoritarian regime. Modi engages in all sorts of abuse. He freezes the accounts of the National Congress Party, but the elections in June, they were really competitive. They were real. He's forced to rule now as a coalition. So to call it an autocracy is a misnomer. What we'll see is a kind of, in broader comparative terms, a kind of soft competitive authoritarian regime where Trump engages in all sorts of, some successful, some not, efforts to harass opposition, to do things like audit the bank accounts of people, of George Soros and others. There's all sorts of things.
He's going to use the Department of Justice. In other words, he's going to instrumentalize a part of the state to go after his political adversaries. There is no way to describe that except an abuse of democratic power and an authoritarian impulse. And he can make life hell for people, there's no question. Because there's no way, that is within the executive branch, and there's no capacity to stop that.
Lucan, you've called January 6th an attempted coup, but others see it as a protest that got out of hand. There seems to be little or no agreement in politics on what is a fact, is truth. What's your? what do you
I think yes, there are partisan elements. Trump calls it a love fest.
Yeah.
But that's just it was clearly
People died.
4 people died.
Yeah.
180 policemen were injured. This was an overt attempt to overturn the election. This is not, by any kind of standard objective way, at all controversial.
There's a large percentage of the Republican electorate who think that the election was stolen, that January 6th was in a way justified.
So
it's not just like a few.
But that's
a definition. I mean, I think it's important to distinguish that there are facts still that objective observers agree on. Yes, it's true. I looked at the numbers. Support for January 6th has actually increased since 2020. But
I think anybody in a position of responsibility in politics, in medicine, in government, it doesn't matter where your expertise is, we have an obligation to be extraordinarily careful to be truthful and to make clear over and over again what's a fact and what's an interpretation. Because we have to rebuild trust with the public. We got here because people lost trust in government and in expertise. That's how we got here. It's not hard to understand. There is, as I said, the feeling that elites are condescending and shut them out. There is a feeling that the system is not fair and is not working for them. And that really, we trace the data, that begins to develop right after the global financial crisis, when nobody went to jail, not a single banker. This is not a US problem alone. We're in front of an absolutely consequential US election because the United States is the United States. But we have an AfD in Germany that we would both agree is anti-democratic. We have a Marine Le Pen in France that is anti-democratic. Orban is Orban. He is anti-democratic. We have a Venezuelan government that is anti-democratic. And those are, Venezuela and Mexico are not among the affluent that Lucan was talking about. We're dealing with a more general problem in developed affluent societies where populism began really. We could argue about when it starts, but it is a tale of a global financial crisis which has multiple causes. And I think in many ways, the process we're in is still deepening. It's one of the worst waves of populism that we've seen.
Basically, the number of democracies in the world increased dramatically until about the early 2000s and has remained basically stable.
Yeah.
So half the countries in the world are democratic, and the other half are non-democratic. So in fact, you have not seen, knock on wood or whatever,
Democratic backsliding.
Serious democratic backsliding. I think that is simply a reality. You've seen, real backsliding. Venezuela is not a hybrid regime; it's a full-scale authoritarian regime. I think things are looking worrisome in India, but elections still are central. India, on balance, is more democratic than authoritarian. So I think that is something worth keeping in mind.
The fact that we're worried about what Trump will do in the world, and that's what I work on, and of course I'm worried about what Trump will do in the world on many, many fronts, is because he's the president of the United States. That's why. But not because he's such he's such a threat to global democracy. That's not where the worry is. The worry with what Trump will do in the world is very well founded because he's attracted to other authoritarian leaders. There's an obvious affinity there. That is not something that we in the democratic world want to see. He's erratic and unpredictable. That is not a recipe for mature leadership by a mature president who has special responsibilities in the democratic world. And finally, and this is, I think, the core of the worry that so many of us have, and I certainly have it, the people that will come to the White House with him this time are far more radical than the people that came with him in 2016. So to generalize from that first presidency to the presidency that we may see is, in fact, to underestimate the nature of the problems that we're going to confront in the world.
What can we do, if anything, as individuals to protect, whether in the US or in Canada, to protect our democratic institutions?
I think maintaining civil discourse and learning to talk with people you disagree with. I think that is what we can do.
You know, it's really interesting because I completely agree with Lucan. First of all, again, let's not forget states and cities really matter. And the United States is a very, very diverse country. The government of California has had more impact on environmental policy than the federal government in the United States. Don't discount the fact that many of the most important states will be represented by Democratic governors who will, in fact, push back against this. And that's part of the reason Lucan and I are saying what we're saying. We have sites in the United States. Yes, some of them are weaker. Courts. Lucan and I were just talking about this. Courts have become more politicized. But what's very strong? Universities. Nobody fools around with us. You get into really big trouble if you try to take us all on, because we fiercely guard our independence. Churches, synagogues, mosques, these are a very important part of our society when society is under threat. The Democratic Party, and in our own country, we have a plurality of parties that will, in fact, fight back the union movement. And even more than that, because those are the obvious places, I think it's a mistake to ignore the capacity of people to self-organize, especially young people who have access to platforms now in ways that they never did. But to come back to what can we do, when is the last time you had dinner with somebody who's a Trump supporter in this country? When did you last actually sit down and talk to that person for an hour? You probably can't remember, because we're doing the same thing. We're sorting into people that we agree with. We stay away from contentious subjects because we don't have the skills anymore to engage in a prolonged conversation with somebody that we disagree with and say, okay, explain to me, why do you think this? Why are you there? What do you mean by this? Here's why I'm worried about this. We have to invest in rebuilding. I couldn't agree more with Lucan. In rebuilding our capacity to have conversations in a genuinely respectful way with people that we strongly disagree with.